I had been working nonstop for 8 months straight. Long days, late nights, back-to-back shifts in the city, trying to make ends meet while keeping my sanity intact. When the burnout hit, it didn't come gradually. It hit like a brick wall. My boss noticed I was slipping, missing small details, zoning out, getting easily irritated, and he basically forced me to take 2 weeks off. I didn't argue. I just nodded, packed my bag that same night, and started planning where to go. A friend of mine once mentioned a secluded cabin in northern Idaho, not far from Priest Lake, surrounded by woods and a few miles away from any paved road. He had rented it a few years back and said it was peaceful and quiet, completely off the grid. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. It sounded like exactly what I needed. I texted him, got the details, called the owner, and wired the payment. Within 3 days, I was on the road with my gear, some canned food, bottled water, a first aid kit, a few books, and my 9mm just in case. The drive up was long, over 12 hours, and by the time I turned onto the last dirt road that led up toward the cabin, the sky had turned dark, heavy clouds gathering over the treetops. I remember passing a rusty, bullet-ridden sign that said, "NO Winter Maintenance," which made me a little nervous, but it was mid-September and still dry. I figured I'd be fine. I finally pulled up to the cabin just after sunset. It looked exactly how I expected. Weathered wood, a tin roof, a little porch with a single rocking chair, and a heavy-looking door with iron hinges. There was a woodpile stacked against the far wall and a metal chimney poking out of the top. Inside, the place was basic but clean. A cot with some wool blankets, a small wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves stocked with candles, matches, and a few old pans. There was a shed out back, padlocked shut, and a small outhouse maybe 40 yards into the woods. I unpacked, cracked open a can of soup, and heated it over the little propane burner I'd brought. That first night was dead silent, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes every small creak sound exaggerated. But I slept surprisingly well. I didn't even wake once. The first few days went exactly how I hoped. I hiked during the day, read books in the afternoon, made simple meals, and spent hours just staring at the trees, listening to the wind move through the pines. I wrote in a small journal, mostly thoughts and random sketches. I hadn't felt that calm in years. Then, on the 4th morning, things started to shift. It began with something small. I was about 1.5 miles out, hiking along a ridge that curved down into a ravine. I had gone that way twice before, so I knew the trail. As I came around a bend, I noticed something odd. Broken branches along the path, fresh ones, as if someone or something had barreled through. First, I figured it was a deer, maybe even a moose. But the way the branches were broken low to the ground and several feet apart, it didn't quite fit. I looked for tracks but found nothing clear. Still, I brushed it off. Animals were everywhere. That's what I was out here to be around, nature. But as I kept walking, I got the strange sensation that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, not because I heard anything, but because the silence had changed. There were no birds, no squirrels rustling, just the sound of my own boots and breathing. I turned back early that day. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up in a cold sweat. I couldn't explain why. No nightmare, no sound, just that prickling feeling you get when someone is standing too close behind you. I lay still for a while, eyes adjusting to the dark, heart racing. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound outside. Leaves or branches, someone walking, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I knew the sound of deer or elk. This was 2 feet, human steps. I reached for my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it at the door. The sound stopped. I sat there for at least 20 minutes, barely breathing. I didn't dare move to the window. Eventually, I crawled back into the sleeping bag with the flashlight still in my hand and the pistol under my pillow. When I went out the next morning, there were no tracks. The ground was too dry, nothing to prove what I heard. I started to doubt myself. But that day, I didn't go hiking. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping some wood, organizing my supplies, checking the area. I didn't see anything out of place until I went behind the cabin near the woodpile. There, sitting on the ground near the wall, was a used cigarette butt. I don't smoke. I hadn't had a visitor. It was fresh, white filter. No signs of water damage or dirt on the paper. Someone had been here. I spent that night inside, windows covered, door locked, gun on the table beside me. I barely slept. The next day, I hiked up to the highest ridge near the cabin. It was a long 2-hour climb, but once I got to the top, I managed to get a weak signal on my phone, just enough to send a couple texts and drop a pin to my brother. I told him everything was fine, but asked him to check in every couple days just in case. I also snapped a few pictures around the cabin and trail, not really sure why, maybe for documentation. When I came back down the ridge, it was already late afternoon, and the sky had started to darken again. Rain, maybe. I picked up the pace, heart pounding for no reason. When I got back to the cabin, the first thing I noticed was the rocking chair. It had moved. Not just shifted, it was facing the other direction entirely. I had left it facing the trees. Now it was pointed toward the front door. I froze. I unlocked the door slowly, gun drawn, but the place was empty. Everything looked the same, except for one thing. On the table sat one of my books, open to the exact page I had stopped on. I hadn't left it that way. I always kept it closed with a rock on top to keep bugs out. I checked every corner, every cabinet, every drawer. Nothing was missing. Nothing else was touched. But someone had been inside. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the corner of the cabin with my back to the wall, wrapped in a blanket, holding my gun, eyes on the door the whole time. Around 3 a.m., I heard the creaking again. Footsteps. They circled the cabin slowly, deliberately, crunching leaves, snapping a twig now and then, like they wanted me to know they were there. Then they stopped right outside the window next to me. I could hear them breathing. No flashlight, no talking, just breathing. Then nothing. By morning, I was mentally shot. I packed half my stuff, hiked back up to the ridge, and sent another message. I told my brother someone was in the woods, possibly stalking the cabin, and if he didn't hear from me every day, he should call the local sheriff. I was ready to leave, but the thought of walking down that road alone, unarmed, knowing someone was nearby, I couldn't do it yet. I decided to stay one more night, just one, and leave early at sunrise. I barely moved that day. I sat inside, gun loaded, every sound sending jolts through my body. Around sunset, I stepped outside just long enough to grab some water from the rain barrel. That's when I saw it. On the far tree line, maybe 100 yards out, stood a man. No movement, no face visible, just the outline of someone standing perfectly still, half hidden in the trees. Watching, I raised the gun. He didn't move. I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with my gun pointed at the door until morning light finally broke. At dawn, I grabbed my bag, shoved everything I could carry into it, and made for the car. As I hiked down the dirt road, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every bird call made me flinch. The car was untouched. I drove straight out of there, didn't stop for gas until I hit a town with a working signal. I called my brother, told him everything. He wanted me to report it, but I didn't have a plate, a name, a photo. Just a cigarette, some footprints I never saw, and the terrifying feeling of being hunted. I never went back. Weeks later, I finally looked through the photos I had taken. Mostly trees, trails, hills, but one of them made my blood run cold. It was a picture of the cabin trail, taken from the ridge above on the day I climbed for signal. In the trees just off to the left was a faint human figure, partially hidden, barely visible, but it was there. A man, watching, camouflaged. I hadn't seen him when I took the photo, but he had been there the whole time. I don't remember what first drew me to the idea of staying alone in a remote cabin for a week. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was the kind of subtle exhaustion that builds up when everything in your life is just fine. Nothing's going wrong, nothing's going great. You start to crave something quiet, space, distance. It was early October, and I had saved up some vacation days that I wasn't using. Work was remote anyway. No kids, no partner, no pets, no real obligations. I had a friend who owned a piece of land in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, pretty far from anything, and a one-room cabin on it that he used mostly for hunting in the fall. It was old but livable, and I remembered him telling me years ago that if I ever wanted to get away, he'd be happy to let me use it. So I texted him, and 2 days later I had the key and the coordinates. He hadn't been out there since last season. Told me to bring everything I'd need. No running water, a wood stove for heat, no cell service, no roads for the last mile. I'd have to park by an old trailhead and hike in. The place wasn't on any map. It was about as off-grid as you could get. That was what I wanted. I left on a Tuesday morning, made the 6-hour drive north, and got to the trailhead around 4 p.m. The last hour of driving had been slow going, dirt roads, no signs, a few wrong turns. It was colder than I expected, mid-40s maybe, and the sky was gray and flat. A few orange leaves still clung to the trees, but most of them had already dropped, giving the woods that bare, skeletal look they have just before winter really hits. I parked, loaded my pack with food, water, clothes, and a few basic tools, then locked the car and started the hike in. It wasn't a bad trail, faint but visible, weaving between tall birches and pine. Took me about an hour to reach the clearing. The cabin stood near the edge of a small lake, weathered and dark, with a low porch and one visible window. I remember thinking it looked like it had just grown out of the woods, like it belonged there. It was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears feel like they're straining. No wind, no birds. I got the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet. One room plus a little closet-like space where there was a composting toilet. Wood plank floors, a cot against one wall, a small table and chair, a blackened old wood stove in the corner. Dust covered everything. Spider webs stretched across the corners. I swept them away with my jacket sleeve and got to work. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood that had been left beside the stove, and lit a fire. The first puff of smoke curled back into the room before the draft caught, and then the warm air started to spread. I heated up a can of soup on the stove, ate it standing by the window, then turned in for the night. I was tired from the drive and the hike. Felt good to lie down. That first night was when I heard it. I had just started to drift off when something thudded against the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't subtle either. A dull, single thump. Not a branch falling. Not an animal scampering. Something with weight. Something deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and listened. Nothing. I held still for what felt like an hour, straining to hear anything. The fire had burned down low, the shadows deepening in the corners of the cabin. I didn't have electricity, just a headlamp and a lantern. I flicked on the headlamp and scanned the inside of the room. Nothing moved. I figured it had to be a raccoon or a deer bumping into the wall. Still, it was hard to sleep after that. I must have finally dozed off because I woke up with sunlight leaking through the window and the fire cold. I told myself I was being paranoid. The woods were full of animals. I was just out of practice being this far off-grid. I made some coffee with my camping stove, stepped outside, and looked around. The ground was covered in damp leaves, soft enough that even a heavy animal wouldn't leave clear prints. I circled the cabin once. No tracks, nothing knocked over, no claw marks or broken branches, just forest and the still water of the lake. I spent that day chopping wood, fishing, didn't catch anything, and walking the perimeter of the lake. There wasn't another cabin or structure in sight. No tire tracks, no trails, no signs that anyone had been out here in months. The lake was perfectly still, too shallow for boats. There wasn't even the hum of distant airplanes or cars. Just wind, trees, and the occasional squirrel or bird. Still, that night I barricaded the door with a chair. Nothing happened. No thud, no movement. I slept a little better. The third day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I followed a ridge west of the cabin for about an hour until I came across what looked like an old deer blind nailed up between two trees. It had collapsed years ago, just a tangle of wood and rusted nails now. But near it, I found something strange. What looked like a fire ring, made from stones that had been blackened by old soot. There were bones inside, small ones, animal bones probably, but they'd been arranged in a neat circle, like a ring inside the ring. I stood there a long time, looking at them. They weren't fresh. They were clean, dry, almost brittle. No smell, no obvious cuts or breaks. Still, the shape they'd been laid in, it didn't look accidental. That night, the thud came again, but this time it was louder. 2 thuds, actually, on different walls, maybe 5 seconds apart. Thump, thump. I didn't move, just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fire was low again. I could hear the creak of the cabin settling, the distant rustle of branches, but nothing else. No footsteps, no voices, no animals chittering. Eventually, I slid out of bed and crept to the window. I crouched and peeked out, just enough to see the clearing. Empty, but I noticed something strange. One of the firewood logs I'd stacked outside was missing. I counted them every time I went in or out. There had been 6 left that afternoon. Now there were 5. In the morning, I found it about 20 feet from the cabin, sitting upright in the middle of the clearing. That was when I knew I wasn't alone. Could have been some kind of animal, maybe a bear, but why would it move a log like that? Place it upright? And besides, I didn't see a single track. The ground was soft. It had rained lightly the night before. Any decent-sized animal should have left something. I thought about leaving, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. I wasn't even halfway through my week. I hadn't seen anyone. No sign of a human presence. Just weird noises and a moved log. So I stayed. But I started sleeping with a hatchet by my bed. The next day, I didn't go far. Just collected more firewood, made some notes in my journal, and listened. Every time a branch snapped in the woods, I froze. Every time the wind gusted, I felt my heart race. That night, it rained hard. Thunder, wind, the whole thing. I could barely hear anything over the noise. The storm shook the trees so violently I thought one might fall on the cabin. At some point after midnight, I got up to pee. I lit my lantern and cracked the door. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not boot prints, bare feet, human feet, dozens of them. They crisscrossed the clearing, overlapping, going in every direction. Some looked small, like a child's. Others were long, narrow. One set had a crooked toe, almost hooked inward. They were fresh, still wet from the rain, the mud glistening in the lantern light, and they led right up to the cabin door. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the corner with the hatchet in my lap, lantern burning low, ears straining. Nothing else happened. No knocks, no voices, just the storm. In the morning, the footprints were gone. The rain had turned the clearing into a soup of leaves and mud. Everything had smeared together. That day, I packed my bag. I wasn't going to wait to see what came next. I didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't even care if I looked paranoid. I just wanted out. I left around noon, after making sure the fire was out and the place was cleaned up. I hiked the trail back, moving fast, not stopping to rest. But when I got to where I'd left the car, my stomach dropped. It was gone. Not just gone. There was no sign it had ever been there. No tire marks. No prints. Nothing. Just wet leaves and the faint trail I'd come in on. I stood there a long time, rain soaking through my jacket. I walked up and down the road for nearly a mile in each direction, thinking maybe I'd made a wrong turn or parked at a different spot. Nothing. No road signs. No houses. No buildings. No car. I had a compass and a paper map in my bag. I sat down in the ditch and tried to reorient myself. If I followed the road west, it should eventually intersect a highway. It would be a long walk, maybe 10 or 15 miles, but I could make it before nightfall if I moved fast. So I walked, and the road never changed. No intersections. I'd always liked the idea of being alone. Not the lonely kind of alone, but the quiet kind. Just me and the trees, away from the constant hum of people, traffic, phones, and every little obligation that pulls at you every minute of the day. So when my cousin offered me his cabin in the mountains for a couple weeks while he was overseas, I said yes immediately. He told me it was quiet, remote, no cell service, and no neighbors for a good 2 miles. It sounded perfect. The drive was long, 7 hours from my apartment in the city, most of it winding mountain roads that got narrower the higher I climbed. I remember passing the last gas station, one of those old pumps with a mechanical counter and a bell that dings when you start filling. That was the last sign of life I saw before turning off onto the dirt road leading up to the cabin. The place wasn't fancy, just a 2-room wooden structure sitting on a slope, surrounded by dense pine forest on all sides. It had no foundation, just raised off the ground on cement blocks, maybe 3 feet high at the tallest point. The crawl space underneath was partially visible from the back. There was a rusted chain link fence half buried in the weeds and moss, and old tools hanging on hooks by the back wall, most of them crusted with age and spiderwebs. A small deck overlooked the trees. I could just barely see the faint shimmer of a creek through the thicket. Inside, it was rustic but comfortable. A wood stove, a kitchenette, a lumpy couch that looked like it belonged in a college dorm, and a bedroom with a sagging bed frame and a mattress that smelled faintly of mildew and pine. There was no internet, no TV, and no radio, just a stack of old books and a journal with half its pages filled with barely legible handwriting. My cousins, I guessed. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I slept in late, made coffee on the gas burner, and spent hours just walking the trails that led deeper into the woods. I'd brought a couple paperbacks, some canned food, and a solar charger for my flashlight and GPS. I took some photos of tree bark, mushrooms, animal tracks. I didn't see any bears, though I heard rustling now and then that made me pause and grip the knife I kept on my belt, just in case. At night, the silence settled like a heavy blanket. It wasn't peaceful silence, it was total. No hum from appliances, no distant cars, not even the wind sometimes. Just the faint creak of the trees outside and the occasional snap of something in the underbrush. The first night it unsettled me, but by the third I'd gotten used to it. I started sleeping better than I had in years, until the 5th night. That evening, I stayed up late reading a book by lantern light. I didn't notice anything strange until I turned off the light and got under the covers. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought it might be an animal, raccoon, maybe a possum. The crawl space was open in places, and small creatures could easily get underneath. I tried to ignore it, but it kept going. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. It sounded deliberate, not the frantic scrambling of an animal, but slow, repetitive. I sat up and listened. After a few seconds, it stopped. I figured whatever it was had left. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I checked under the cabin. I took my flashlight and crouched down at the back where the space was highest. It was mostly dirt and rocks, with a few broken boards, rusted nails, and some trash, beer cans, cigarette butts, a plastic fork. It looked like someone had used the crawl space as a dumping spot a long time ago. I didn't see any fresh tracks, no animal droppings, no signs of anything living down there. I shrugged it off. Probably just my imagination. That night, the sound came back, but this time it was closer. Started just after midnight, right beneath the bedroom. I lay perfectly still, listening. The scratch was softer now, like fingernails against wood. Then there was a muffled thud, like something heavy shifting its weight. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was nothing. After several minutes, it stopped again. I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, I inspected the crawl space again, this time more thoroughly. I found what looked like a spot where the dirt had been recently disturbed. It was subtle, but I could see where the leaves and pebbles had been brushed aside in a small clearing under the bedroom. I got down on my stomach and aimed the flashlight deeper into the darkness. I didn't see anything, just more dirt, a few broken boards, and a spider skittering away from the light. That evening, I blocked off the entrance with cinder blocks and some wire mesh I found behind the cabin. I figured if something was getting in, it wouldn't now. That night, I heard it again. This time it wasn't scratching, it was breathing. Not the wind, not the settling of wood. It was unmistakable. A slow, rhythmic inhale and exhale, like someone sleeping directly beneath me. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening to it for over an hour. It never changed pace, never spoke, never shifted, just a deep, slow breath in the dark beneath the floor. By morning, it was gone. I went outside and checked the mesh I'd put up. It was still in place, untouched, no holes, no signs of digging. I even circled the cabin and looked for any kind of prints, but the pine needles and leaves made it hard to tell. There was nothing conclusive. I started keeping the hatchet beside my bed. The next few nights were quiet. No breathing, no scratching. I began to think maybe I'd been dreaming, or maybe there'd been a raccoon or a fox under there, and it had moved on. I almost started to relax again, until the 11th night. That evening, something changed. I felt it as soon as the sun went down. The air seemed stiller, heavier. I didn't read that night. I just sat on the couch, staring out the window into the darkness. I left the lantern off and listened. Around midnight, I heard a sound from the deck. It was the wood creaking just once, like someone had stepped on it, then stopped. I stood up slowly and picked up the hatchet. I moved to the window and tried to peer out, but it was pitch black beyond the glass. No moon, no stars, just trees and shadows. Another creak, closer to the door. I backed into the kitchen and waited, holding my breath. Then nothing. The next morning, I checked the deck. No tracks, but the mud at the bottom of the steps looked disturbed, like someone had walked up from the woods. I started considering going home early, but something held me back. Pride, maybe, or stupidity. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably an animal, maybe a bear. I didn't want to look like an idiot when I told people I left early because the floor made weird noises. That afternoon, I went for a long hike, tried to clear my head. I made it back around dusk. I found the front door ajar. I was sure I had locked it. I stood there for a long time before stepping inside. Everything looked normal. Nothing taken, nothing moved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, that they were still close. I stayed up all night with the hatchet in my lap. At dawn, I packed my bag. I'd had enough. I stuffed what I could into my backpack, double-checked the door, and started the long hike back down to where I'd parked the truck. I figured I'd be home by late evening. I reached the truck just after noon. That's when I saw the flat tire. Not just flat, slashed. 3 clean cuts right through the sidewall. My stomach turned. I checked the others. The front passenger tire had the same marks. I looked around the area. No footprints, no tools, nothing. That road was 10 miles from the nearest town, and I hadn't seen another soul in 2 weeks. Someone had done this, and they'd done it quietly. I had no cell service, no radio, no signal of any kind. I hiked back to the cabin. When I got there, the door was wide open. I approached slowly, cautiously, hatchet in hand. Inside, everything looked the same. Nothing obviously missing, but the rug in front of the couch had been flipped over. The books were scattered on the floor. One of the kitchen drawers was open. I didn't sleep that night. I pushed the dresser in front of the door and stayed in the corner with my back against the wall, watching the windows until sunrise. The next day, I hiked south, hoping to catch a signal. I carried only the essentials: GPS, knife, flashlight, water, a flare. I got a single bar of service at the peak of a ridge and called for a tow truck. It took 10 tries before it went through. The dispatcher said it would be at least a day before they could reach me, maybe 2. The roads were rough. I went back to the cabin and waited. That night was the worst. I heard footsteps on the roof. It started around 1 a.m., a slow, deliberate step above the bedroom. Then silence. Then another over the living room. Then silence again. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Then came the breathing again, this time not under the floor. It was inside. Somewhere in the cabin, someone was breathing. I stayed frozen until dawn. When the first light came through the trees, I checked every inch of the cabin. The attic hatch was sealed. The crawl space was undisturbed. But I noticed something that hadn't been there before. I hadn't planned on staying in that cabin. The whole trip was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway. Just me and the woods. I wanted to escape the city's noise, the constant buzz of people and traffic, to clear my head. I figured I'd hike in, spend a night or two under the stars, then come back feeling better. I had done plenty of solo camping trips before, always in spots where I could pitch a tent or find a campsite. But this one ended up different. The plan was to hike into a remote part of the forest, in the northern part of my state. Dense pine trees, rough terrain, and a few old logging roads abandoned decades ago. I didn't have a clear destination. I just wanted to find a quiet place, maybe set up camp near a creek or a clearing. When I started walking, the air was cold, and the sky was a dull gray. The forecast had said it would rain by nightfall, so I packed accordingly, with rain gear and extra layers. I also had a small backpack with essentials: water, food, a first aid kit, my sleeping bag, and a small camping stove. After a few hours of walking along a rough trail, I came across a narrow dirt road that looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The road twisted and turned deeper into the woods. I followed it, hoping it would lead to a clearing or a decent camping spot. Instead, after about 30 minutes, I saw the cabin. It was a small, old wooden structure, set back from the road by maybe 50 feet. The cabin looked like it had been there for decades. The wood weathered and cracked, covered in patches of moss and lichen. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were grimy but unbroken. The door was closed, with an old metal latch that didn't seem too sturdy but still held. At first, I was hesitant. I hadn't planned on staying in a cabin, especially one that looked so run down. But then I realized the rain was starting to pick up, steady and cold, the kind that chills you through your jacket no matter how many layers you wear. Setting up my tent in the mud and wet ground didn't sound appealing at all. I was tired too, and the idea of a dry roof sounded good. I decided to check the cabin out. Maybe it was abandoned, but at least I could stay inside for the night. I pushed the door gently. It creaked open, revealing a small room inside with a dirt floor covered by a thin layer of old straw. There was a wood stove in the corner, cold and rusted. A few old chairs and a table were scattered around, and some rusty tools hung on the walls. The place smelled musty, like old wood and damp earth. I didn't find any food or supplies, but there was a pile of chopped firewood stacked outside next to the porch. I didn't find any signs that someone had been there recently. No footprints in the mud, no cigarette butts or trash. But it was clear the cabin wasn't totally forgotten. Someone came here sometimes, maybe hunters or hikers like me. I decided to make the cabin my shelter for the night. I grabbed some firewood and got a fire going in the stove. It took a while to catch, but after a few minutes, the warmth started to spread. I took off my wet jacket, sat down on one of the chairs, and ate some canned beans I had brought along. The rain was steady outside, tapping on the roof like a slow drum. That's when I first heard the footsteps. They were soft but distinct. Something was moving outside. I stood up quickly, my heart jumping. I stepped to the window and looked out into the rain, but the thick trees and darkness made it impossible to see clearly. The steps stopped. I held my breath. After a minute, I told myself it was probably just an animal or the wind knocking branches around. I tried to calm down and went back to the fire. But then the footsteps started again, this time slower, heavier, and they were coming closer, towards the cabin. I grabbed my small pocket knife, not because I expected to fight anyone, but because it was something to hold on to. I moved to the door and quietly opened it just a crack, peeking out. Nothing. The rain blurred the edges of the forest, the trees swaying with the wind, but no sign of anyone or anything. I closed the door and locked the latch as best as I could. I sat down by the fire again, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but the footsteps had unsettled me. I tried to focus on the flames, but I kept glancing out the window, watching for any movement. The rain slowed down after an hour or so, and I finally felt myself relax a bit. I lay down on the straw-covered floor, using my backpack as a pillow. The fire was dying down, but I still felt warm enough. I figured I would get some sleep, rest up, and be on my way early in the morning. I woke up hours later, not sure if it was the middle of the night or dawn. Something felt off. The air inside the cabin was colder than before, and the fire had completely died out. I got up and fumbled for my lighter, but it was empty. I hadn't brought extra fuel. I knew I had to get more firewood to start the stove again, or I'd freeze before sunrise. I put on my wet jacket and stepped outside. The forest was dark, with a thin fog hanging between the trees. I saw the pile of firewood near the porch, but something stopped me before I could reach it. The ground was covered with deep footprints, heavy, wide, and uneven. They looked fresh, like they had been made not long ago. They led away from the cabin into the woods. That's when I noticed something else. The dirt road I had walked in on was gone. Not physically gone, of course, but it looked like the forest had swallowed it. The trail was now covered with thick branches and fallen leaves, and the tracks I had followed to get here had disappeared completely. I stared down the trail, trying to find any sign of a path. The trees were too dense, the undergrowth thick. It didn't look like any normal trail anymore. It was as if the forest had closed itself off. I started to panic. I went back inside the cabin and grabbed my phone to check the signal. No service. No surprise. I had been expecting that. I checked the time. It was 3:42 a.m. I could hear something outside. Not footsteps this time, but a slow, heavy breathing. Low and deep. Sounded close. I froze. The breathing came from the side of the cabin, where the woods were thickest. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and turned it on, sweeping the beam over the trees. I caught a glimpse of something, a dark shape moving just beyond the edge of the light. It vanished before I could see clearly. My heart was pounding. I shut the door quickly and locked it again. I sat back down near the window, knife in hand, and tried to calm down. I told myself it was probably a bear or a large animal, but the breathing continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. I didn't sleep again. When dawn finally came, I went outside carefully, shining my flashlight around. The footprints were still there, fresh and deep. They went all around the cabin, circling it, then leading off into the woods again. I knew I had to get out. I packed up quickly, grabbing everything I could. But when I tried to leave down the path I had come in on, I was stopped again by the forest. The trail was overgrown, almost impossible to walk through. I pushed forward, branches scratching my face and hands. But after 20 minutes, I realized I was going in circles. I was trapped. I decided to climb a tree to see if I could spot any sign of the road or the dirt path. I found a tall pine, climbed as high as I dared, and looked around. The forest stretched in every direction, thick and endless. There was no sign of roads, no clearings, just trees and more trees. I climbed down and sat on a fallen log, exhausted and scared. The heavy breathing started again. This time it was closer than ever. I stayed as still as I could, listening. After a long moment, I saw it. A large figure, covered in dark fur, standing just on the edge of the trees, looking at me. It wasn't a bear. It was something else. Taller, heavier, with long arms. I felt my throat tighten, my body freeze. I remembered everything I knew about animals in the forest. No creature this big should be out here, especially in the day. The figure didn't move. It watched me. After a few minutes, it turned and disappeared back into the forest. I ran back to the cabin, locked the door, and sat down trembling. I realized then that I wasn't just lost. I was being hunted. For the rest of that day, I stayed inside, too scared to move. At night, the breathing came back, closer and louder. I tried to stay calm. I tried to think. I remembered the pile of firewood outside the cabin. If I could start a fire, maybe the smoke would keep whatever it was away. But my lighter was dead, and I had no matches. I searched the cabin again, and in a dusty corner under the table, I found an old box of waterproof matches. They were damp, but maybe usable. I tried one. It sparked and caught. I got a fire going in the stove again. The smoke filled the cabin, and I felt a little safer. That night, the breathing didn't come near the cabin. In the morning, I planned my escape again. I waited until the sky was clear and the sun was high. I packed everything and decided to follow the footprints. They were the only signs of something real in this place. I took a deep breath and stepped into the forest. It had been a long time since I'd taken a break from the noise of the city. Work had been relentless, the stress mounting every day until it felt like my head would burst. I needed to get away. Just me, a cabin in the woods, and nothing but silence. No phones, no internet, no people. Just nature and myself. I found a small, isolated cabin deep in the forest, far from the nearest town. The pictures online made it look perfect. A sturdy wooden cabin with a fireplace, a small porch surrounded by tall trees that blocked out the world. It was exactly what I needed. I packed my gear carefully: warm clothes, food supplies, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and plenty of firewood. I was prepared. At least I thought I was. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads that grew rougher the closer I got. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I could feel the weight of the quiet settling on me like a thick blanket. No cars, no people, just the sound of wind brushing through the trees and distant bird calls. I took a deep breath and stepped out, the smell of pine filling my lungs. The cabin was smaller than I expected. It had one room with a small kitchen area, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove. A thin layer of dust covered everything, showing it hadn't been used in months. I didn't care. I was here to be alone, to disconnect. I unloaded my stuff and started a fire in the stove, letting the warmth spread through the room. Outside, the sun was starting to set, and the sky turned a soft orange behind the thick forest. I spent the first night enjoying the silence, reading by the firelight, feeling the calm wash over me. It was exactly what I needed. The woods outside seemed peaceful, even beautiful. The stars shone brightly through the gaps in the trees, and the occasional hoot of an owl was the only sound breaking the stillness. I went to bed early, exhausted but content. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense but not too wild. I followed a narrow trail that curved around a small creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I collected some fresh water, filling my bottle carefully. The woods were quiet except for the rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. Felt safe, almost too safe. I noticed a few old animal tracks in the mud near the creek. Probably deer or raccoons, but nothing to worry about. Back at the cabin, I cleaned up a bit and prepared a simple meal. I had canned beans, bread, and some dried fruit. The food was bland but filling. The fire was my constant companion, crackling and popping as I sat nearby. I read more and tried to write down my thoughts, something I hadn't done in years. I could feel the weight of city life slipping away, replaced by a slow calm. That night, though, something changed. I was lying in bed when I heard it, a faint, scratching noise coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird scratching against the cabin walls. But the sound was too persistent, too deliberate. It didn't move around. It stayed in one spot, scratching rhythmically. I sat up, eyes straining in the dark. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, barely lighting the room. I grabbed my flashlight from the bedside table and aimed it out the small window facing the front porch. The beam cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything moving. The scratching stopped. I waited, heart pounding, listening for any other sounds. Nothing. I told myself it was just a squirrel or some small animal. The forest was full of them. I lay back down, but sleep was difficult. My mind kept running through every possible explanation, each one making me a little more uneasy. Morning finally came, and I felt better in the daylight. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild in the quiet. I decided to explore further, wanting to distract myself. I packed a small bag and set off on a longer trail I'd seen on the cabin's old map. The trail took me deeper into the forest, past thick clusters of trees and over fallen logs. The ground was soft and damp, covered in pine needles. I noticed more animal tracks, and at one point, fresh bear prints in the mud. I froze for a moment, heart quickening, but the tracks didn't look fresh enough to worry about an immediate encounter. I kept going until I reached a small clearing with a shallow pond. The sunlight filtered through the trees, sparkling on the water's surface. It was peaceful, and I sat down on a fallen tree trunk to rest. That's when I noticed the broken branches around the edges of the clearing. It looked like something large had pushed through the trees recently. I scanned the area carefully. There were no animals in sight, but the damage was clear. My unease from the previous night started to creep back. I didn't see anything threatening, so I tried to relax and took some photos with my phone. I wasn't expecting signal, but it had a tiny bit of coverage. I sent a quick text to a friend back home, just to say I was okay. No answer, but that was normal out here. On the way back, I stayed alert, keeping an eye on the trail and the woods around me. The forest felt different than before, heavier somehow, more oppressive. The peaceful quiet from the first day was gone, replaced by a subtle tension. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd on the porch. A small pile of dirt and leaves was scattered near the steps, and the wood floor looked scratched in one spot. It was subtle but definitely new. I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked and secure. I hadn't heard anyone approaching, and the road to the cabin was far and rough. It didn't make sense. I brushed it off, thinking maybe a wild animal had been curious. I locked the door again and sat by the fire to calm down. That night, the scratching came back, louder this time. It wasn't on the porch, but from the back of the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The sound was deliberate and slow, like claws scraping against wood or stone. I grabbed my flashlight again and aimed it toward the back window. Suddenly, something moved just beyond the edge of the light. I caught a glimpse of dark fur and something large. My heart slammed against my chest. It was too big to be a raccoon or a dog. A bear? Possibly. But bears usually avoid humans if they can. This felt different. I stayed inside, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The noise continued for a long time. Scratching, sniffing, rustling. Then it stopped. No footsteps, no growls, just silence. I didn't sleep much that night. The forest, which had seemed like a refuge, now felt like a trap. The next morning, I decided to check the back of the cabin. I moved cautiously, flashlight in hand. The ground was disturbed, with deep claw marks gouged into the wood of the cabin's foundation. Scratches and dents marked the lower walls, as if something had tried to get inside. I found torn fabric caught on a nail near the base of the porch stairs. Maybe from my jacket or backpack, but I couldn't remember leaving anything outside. I felt exposed and vulnerable. I wanted to leave, but the nearest town was hours away, and my car was stuck at the end of the dirt road. Plus, I didn't have enough gas to make a long trip today. As the day went on, I tried to keep busy. I gathered more firewood, cleaned the cabin, and prepared a larger meal. Still, the tension never left me. Every noise outside, every shadow made my heart race. Late afternoon brought a heavy storm. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, and rain began pounding on the roof. Thunder rumbled, and the wind rattled the windows. It was loud enough to drown out the sounds outside, but I stayed on edge, worried about what might be waiting in the forest once the storm passed. During the storm, the cabin felt like a fragile shell against the wild. I checked my supplies: food, water, firewood, all enough to last a few more days if needed. I kept the fire going to stay warm and dry. When the storm finally passed late at night, the forest was soaked and silent. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting pale light on the wet trees. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing. Then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, heart hammering. The steps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath. A faint scratching noise followed. At the bottom of the door, someone or something was trying to get in. I grabbed my heaviest flashlight and crept to the door. My hands trembled as I peered through the peephole. Outside, in the silver moonlight, I could see a figure crouching near the porch steps. It was dark, motionless, but unmistakably human. Panic surged through me. I realized I was not alone out here. Someone had followed me or found this place. My mind raced. Was this a robber? A stalker? Someone dangerous? I had no way to call for help. I slammed the door shut and locked it tightly. I grabbed the largest knife I had in the kitchen. Not much, but better than nothing, and backed away into the corner of the cabin, ready to defend myself. The figure stayed outside for what felt like hours. It was late October when I decided to take a break from the city and head into the woods for a few days. I had found a small cabin listed on a rental site, not far from a state forest I'd always wanted to explore. The pictures showed a modest, weathered wooden cabin, sitting quietly among tall pines. No cell service, no internet, just pure isolation. I was craving that. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise, the endless screen time, the pressure of work. I packed what I thought I'd need: warm clothes, canned food, a few bottles of water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, matches, and some batteries. I brought my old camping knife, a sturdy folding saw, and a small axe that looked ancient but was surprisingly sharp. I left the city early in the morning, driving along winding roads that gradually narrowed and became dirt as I neared the cabin. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light on the red and yellow leaves falling around me. The air smelled clean and sharp. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like in the pictures. Small and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The door had an old iron latch and the windows were dusty. I stepped inside and felt a rush of cool, stale air. The place smelled like old wood and damp earth. There was a small living area with a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a fireplace with some old logs inside, and a mattress on the floor covered with a thin, faded blanket. The kitchen was tiny, with a rusted sink, a small counter, and an ancient gas stove. There was no fridge, but a small wood box in the corner where I assumed I could keep food cool. I set down my bags and opened the windows to let fresh air in. Outside, the forest was quiet except for the distant call of birds and the rustling of leaves. The sun was setting, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange. I gathered some dry wood from the porch and lit a fire in the fireplace, watching the flames crackle and throw dancing shadows across the walls. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans warmed over the fire, ate slowly, and then settled down with a book. Night came quickly. Without streetlights or city noise, the darkness outside was absolute. I kept the fire burning low and the flashlight close by. At first, the quiet was peaceful, but as the hours passed, I began to notice other sounds. The snapping of twigs just beyond the porch, the faint scuffle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. It wasn't frightening, exactly, but it reminded me how alone I was. I tried to sleep, but the mattress was thin and hard, and the cold crept in through the gaps in the walls. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside the cabin. I sat up fast, shining the flashlight at the window, but saw nothing but swaying branches and empty darkness. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I decided to explore the nearby woods. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, my knife, and the axe just in case. The forest was dense, with a thick carpet of dead leaves muffling my footsteps. The trees towered above, their branches bare except for a few stubborn brown leaves. I walked for hours, following animal trails, climbing over fallen logs, and crossing shallow streams. The silence was broken only by birds and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. At one point, I noticed some fresh tracks in the mud, large, heavy footprints that looked like boots, not animal paws. I followed them for a while, curious. They led deeper into the forest, toward a small clearing I hadn't seen on the map. When I reached it, I found a makeshift campsite, recently abandoned. There was a small fire pit with cold ashes, a few empty cans, and a tattered sleeping bag. The area was scattered with scraps of food packaging and some empty bottles. It felt strange, as though someone else had been here recently and left in a hurry. I looked around for any sign of who they might be, but saw nothing else. I pocketed a small piece of broken glass I found near the fire pit, thinking it might come in handy. Then I headed back to the cabin, feeling a little uneasy but not alarmed. That night, the noises outside the cabin were louder. Branches snapped closer to the windows, and I heard heavy breathing outside. I sat by the fire with my knife on my lap, listening. After a while, the sound stopped, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I stayed awake until dawn, my senses on edge. The following morning, I decided to clear a path around the cabin. I grabbed the axe and started cutting away some low branches and dead brush, trying to make the area more open so I could see any approaching animals or people. As I worked, I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. After a few hours, I noticed a new set of footprints leading to the cabin from the woods. They were fresh, muddy, and definitely made by boots. Whoever had been in the clearing the day before had come closer. I checked the windows and found one of them had been scratched from the outside, deep marks in the wood that looked recent. My stomach tightened. I sat down on the porch trying to stay calm. It was clear someone had been near the cabin, watching. Maybe they lived nearby or used the forest to camp. I thought about leaving, but my car was several miles back on the dirt road, and I wasn't sure how long it would take to get out. Plus, I hadn't brought much with me, and I needed to pack carefully if I wanted to leave. That night, I set several traps around the cabin using wire and sticks, mostly just noise traps to alert me if someone tried to come close. I also made sure to lock the door latch tightly and placed heavy furniture against it. I kept my axe within reach and the flashlight charged. The night was tense. At one point, I heard heavy footsteps circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, clutching the axe. The sound stopped suddenly, then started again on the other side of the building. For nearly an hour, the footsteps moved in a circle, never stopping, never breaking into a run or a sudden dash. At dawn, the footsteps stopped. I waited another hour, then cautiously stepped outside. Around the cabin, I found footprints all over the ground, too many to count, going every which way. Some of them led to the woods, others headed toward the dirt road. I decided then I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, grabbing what I could carry. I made sure the fire was out and the cabin looked undisturbed. As I stepped onto the road, I took one last look back at the cabin, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The walk back to the car took longer than I expected. The forest seemed thicker, darker, and the silence heavier. Every crack and rustle made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and started the engine immediately. I kept the doors locked as I drove away, watching the trees slip past in the early morning light. A few days later, back in the city with cell service and people around, I checked the news and local reports. There had been several reports of a man living rough in the forest near the cabin, someone who had been stealing supplies from hikers and occasionally attacking them. The police were searching but hadn't found him yet. Looking back, I realized how close I had come to something dangerous. It wasn't ghosts or myths, just a real person, hiding in the woods, watching, waiting. The cabin wasn't a peaceful retreat. It was a trap. I learned a few things from that trip. The woods are beautiful but unpredictable. Isolation can make you vulnerable. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't creatures of legend, but other people, real, dangerous, and very close. I was working from home too much, staring at screens for hours and barely going outside. I wasn't depressed, exactly, but something felt off, like I was slowly disconnecting from real life and I didn't even notice it until it got too loud in my head. So I figured, why not go off-grid for a bit? Just a week. No emails, no phone, no people. I found a listing online for a remote cabin in a place called Dry Pine Hollow, about 4 hours from where I lived. It had no cell service, no internet, and no neighbors for at least a mile in every direction. That was the appeal. I booked it. The owner, an older guy named Richard, gave me a list of instructions in an email. How to get there, since GPS would cut out, how to work the old propane stove, how to use the water pump, how to lock the windows, which I thought was weird to point out, and where to find the keys. He even sent photos of the place. A small A-frame cabin tucked between tall, dry pines, with one bedroom, a kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and a wraparound deck that overlooked a sloped hill that dropped off into thick woods. It looked peaceful, quiet. I left early on a Monday morning, packed with more supplies than I needed, Cans of food, pasta, jerky, bottles of water, batteries, a crank radio, first aid stuff, flashlights, extra clothes, a folding knife, and even a flare gun just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble. I just liked being prepared. The drive took most of the day. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then gravel to dirt. After the final landmark, a rusted-out blue mailbox with no house near it, I turned onto a single-lane trail barely wide enough for my car. Pine branches scratched at the sides as I crept deeper into the woods. Eventually, I saw the cabin through the trees. It looked exactly like the pictures. Old but sturdy, with a dark green roof and a thick wooden door that looked like it belonged on a castle. The air smelled like pine needles and dry soil. I could hear wind in the trees and nothing else. No birds, no bugs, just wind. I found the key in the spot Richard mentioned, a tin box under a loose floorboard on the porch. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The inside was shaded and musty but clean, rustic. The floorboards creaked under my boots. The bedroom was small, just a cot and a nightstand. The kitchen had a small sink, a gas stove, and shelves lined with old canned goods. The bathroom had a metal shower stall and a composting toilet. Everything smelled faintly of mildew and sawdust. I unpacked, set my things down, and made a small dinner, beans and rice on the stove. The propane worked fine, though the flame was touchy. I opened the windows to air the place out. As I stood on the deck eating, I stared out into the woods and let the silence settle in. That was what I came for. Silence. It didn't take long for things to start feeling off. The first night was uneventful. I read a book by lantern light, listened to the wind through the pines, and slept like a rock. But by the second night, I started noticing small things that didn't sit right. Nothing big, not at first, like how the back door, the one that led out to a small slope behind the cabin, was unlatched in the morning when I was sure I had locked it. I figured maybe I had just missed it, but it stuck with me. Then, the next day, I found fresh scuff marks in the dirt just outside that same door. Not boot prints, but drag marks, like something heavy had been moved or pulled. I stood staring at them for a long time. I walked the edge of the tree line and saw more of them, irregular and shallow, disappearing into the underbrush. I told myself it could have been an animal, a bear maybe, but there were no claw prints, just long, messy trails like something had been dragged or shuffled. I stopped leaving the doors open after that. By the third night, I started hearing things. It began around midnight. I was lying in bed, still half awake, when I heard a dull thump, not outside, from inside the cabin, came from the living room area. I sat up, heart jumping, and listened. Another thump, then nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and stepped out of the bedroom. Everything looked the same. I checked the doors. Both were locked. The windows too. I scanned the floor, the walls, the corners. Nothing. No animal. No person. Just an empty room that felt somehow less empty. I stayed up for another hour, then went back to bed. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I noticed the lantern on the table had moved. Only a few inches, but it wasn't where I'd left it. I always placed it on the right side of the table. It was on the left now. I stood over it for a long time, thinking, wondering. I kept trying to come up with normal reasons for everything. Maybe I bumped the table and didn't notice. Maybe the propane stove made the thumping sound as it cooled. Maybe raccoons made the drag marks. Maybe I was just freaking myself out. But deep down, I didn't believe any of that. I didn't like how still the forest was during the day, how it went completely silent in the evenings, like the whole area was holding its breath. I didn't like how cold the inside of the cabin stayed, even when the sun was hot outside. And I didn't like that every night something small happened. Something just weird enough to make me doubt myself. The fourth night, I was sure someone was outside. I had just shut off the lantern and crawled into bed when I heard it. Leaves crunching. Slow, uneven footsteps. Not a deer. Not a raccoon. It sounded like a person trying not to be heard. I laid still, holding my breath, straining to listen. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped at the back wall. Right near the bedroom, I could hear breathing. Low, slow breathing. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. My hands shook under the blanket. I had my knife within reach, but what good would that do? I didn't even know what I was dealing with. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then faded. I heard more footsteps, then silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed everything as fast as I could. I jammed it all into my car, double-checked the cabin, and was ready to go by noon. But the car wouldn't start. Cranked, clicked, and coughed, but wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood, checked the battery terminals. Everything looked fine. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the gas gauge. Full. Then I looked underneath. My gas line had been cut. It wasn't frayed. It wasn't chewed. It was clean, like someone had sliced it with a knife. That was when I really felt fear. Not the creeping kind, the full-body kind. My hands shook as I backed away from the car. I looked around me at the trees, at the empty trail leading out. I was stuck. No cell service, no satellite signal, no one to call. I was a full day's hike from the nearest road, and whoever was out there, they knew I was stuck now. I spent the rest of the day barricading the cabin. I dragged furniture in front of the doors. I jammed nails through boards and braced them against the windows. I made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries, kept my knife within reach, and loaded the flare gun. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I sat by the window and waited. That night, they came back. This time, it was more than just footsteps. Around midnight, I heard the front door rattle, then the back door, then scratching on the walls, slow, rhythmic, almost lazy, like they were playing with me. The windows stayed shut. The boards held, but I could hear them, walking, breathing, whispering things I couldn't make out. Just noise, teeth on wood, fingers tapping. It lasted for hours. I didn't sleep. I just sat with the flare gun aimed at the door, eyes wide, heart pounding, waiting for them to try something real. They didn't. Not that night. The next morning, I made a plan. I couldn't stay in the cabin. That was obvious now. I had enough food and water to survive, sure, but I wouldn't survive them. Whoever they were, they wanted me here, trapped, scared, waiting. I couldn't play their game, so I packed my bag light, just water, food, knife, flare gun, and a printed map. I had marked the route out earlier just in case. According to the map, there was an old logging road about 5 miles south. It hadn't been used in years, but it was my best shot. If I could get to it, I could follow it to the main road and flag someone down. I left at first light. I didn't take the trail. I cut straight through the trees, using the sun and the map to keep my bearings. I moved fast, stopping only when I heard something. Once I saw movement behind me, a shape, a blur. I didn't stop to look. By mid-afternoon, I found the logging road. It was overgrown, but still passable. I followed it, heart pounding the entire time. Every crack of a branch made me flinch. Every rustle in the trees made me look back. Around dusk, I heard an engine. I scrambled toward the sound, crashed through the underbrush, and nearly fell into the road. A green pickup truck was idling there, an old man in the driver's seat. I waved him down. He braked, rolled. It wasn't planned, not really. I had been on the road for 12 hours, trying to make it across the state before dark. My back ached, my eyes felt heavy, and I was running low on caffeine and patience. I had been driving north through a thick stretch of forest road, somewhere deep in the central part of the state, where the trees stood tall and tight, casting long shadows across the 2-lane blacktop. There was no cell signal, no gas stations. I hadn't seen a single other car in almost 2 hours. I was supposed to be heading toward my uncle's property. He owned some land near a lake, a ways out from civilization, where I was going to spend a few quiet days. But I'd taken a wrong turn back near the county line and hadn't realized it until I was already too far in to backtrack without running out of gas. The sun had dropped behind the trees fast, and with no light on the road and nothing but empty woods around me, I figured I had to stop and sleep somewhere before I ended up dozing off behind the wheel. That's when I saw the cabin. It wasn't right by the road. I noticed a gap in the trees, a little gravel path just wide enough for one vehicle, mostly overgrown with weeds and leaves. There was an old wooden sign half covered in moss, leaning at an angle, but no words on it anymore, just the ghost of letters that time had erased. I almost drove past it, but curiosity and desperation made me stop. I backed up and turned onto the path, tires crunching over loose gravel and branches. The path twisted through the trees for about 200 yards before opening up into a small clearing. That's when I saw the cabin. It was old but not falling apart. Weathered wood, a rusted metal roof, a front porch with a broken railing. The windows had curtains drawn on the inside. There was an outhouse a few yards off to the right, barely visible in the dimming light. No car, no lights, just the quiet hum of the woods and the last orange light of day slipping away behind the tree line. I sat in the car for a few minutes, thinking maybe this was a bad idea, but I was tired. I figured I'd just sleep in the back seat, maybe check if the cabin was unlocked just to stretch out a bit. I wasn't trying to steal anything, just needed a place to crash for a few hours before finding my way back to the highway. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The air was cooler now, and the forest felt thick with silence. Not the peaceful kind either. Felt like the woods were holding their breath. I walked up to the porch, boards creaking under my boots, and tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, it smelled like dust and dry wood. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for a long time, but someone had clearly used it. There was an old wood stove, some stacked firewood, a couple of shelves with canned food, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cot in the corner with a blanket folded on top. Nothing fancy, but it looked clean, like someone had taken care of it in a basic way. I checked every room. There were only 2. The main area and a back room with a small bed and a few cabinets. Nothing unusual. No electricity. Just the glow of my flashlight and whatever moonlight slipped through the cracks. I figured I'd crash for a few hours and head out at sunrise. I took the cot in the main room and lay down with my backpack for a pillow. It was colder than I expected, so I pulled the blanket over me. It smelled old but not awful. I listened to the sounds of the forest outside for a while. Crickets, a breeze rustling the trees, the occasional snap of a twig. Normal stuff. But then, sometime after midnight, I heard something else. It was subtle at first, just a soft scraping sound, like branches against wood. I figured it was just the wind brushing the trees against the cabin walls. But then it came again, louder this time, more deliberate. A slow, dragging sound across the porch boards, right outside the door. I sat up, heart thudding, and listened. Nothing. Silence again. I convinced myself it was probably a raccoon or some animal looking for food. I lay back down. Then came the knock. 3 soft knocks. Not loud, not rushed, just slow and careful. I froze. My breathing stopped. I didn't move for a long time. No other sounds followed. I waited, staring at the door in the dim light from my flashlight, which I'd left on the floor next to the cot. After 5 minutes, nothing. I told myself maybe it was the wind or some falling branch. I knew it didn't sound like that, but I needed to believe it if I wanted to sleep. Eventually, I dozed off again, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. When I woke up, it was still dark, but lighter than before. Maybe 4 or 5 a.m. The forest outside was gray and quiet. I decided to leave. Whatever happened last night, I didn't want to stay any longer. I packed up, opened the door, and stopped. There were footprints on the porch. Not boot prints, not shoes, bare feet. One set, darkened with mud. Long toes, deep, wide impressions. They led up to the door and then turned around, heading back toward the tree line. I looked out into the woods, but saw nothing, just trees and shadows. I followed the prints with my eyes. They disappeared into the underbrush a few feet from the clearing. I got in my car, started it up, and backed out fast. I didn't care about the bumps and branches. I just wanted out of there. I drove until I found the highway again and finally got cell signal around noon. I checked the map. I had been way off course. No cabins were listed in that area. No private campgrounds. Nothing. I tried to forget about it, told myself it was probably a homeless person or a hermit, something that could be explained. But a week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I went back. I had to know. This time, I brought a camera, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I left early in the morning and got there just after noon. The gravel path looked the same, still overgrown, still barely visible. I parked at the edge of the woods and walked the rest of the way in on foot. When I reached the clearing, the cabin was gone. Not destroyed, not burned, gone. No structure, no porch, no foundation, just a patch of flattened earth with some old boards scattered around, half buried in the dirt. The outhouse was still there, leaning and broken, but the cabin was completely missing. I walked in circles around the clearing, trying to make sense of it. I took photos, took samples, even checked the trees nearby for signs of recent movement or machinery. Nothing. No tire tracks, no footprints, no signs anyone had been there recently at all. I looked at the spot where the door used to be, the place I'd seen the footprints, the place where I'd heard those slow, soft knocks. And that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. In the dirt, just past the tree line, was a shallow depression. A kind of trench, maybe 2 feet wide, running along the edge of the clearing, almost like someone had dug a perimeter. It was old, but not ancient, maybe a year or two. Inside that shallow trench were bones, small bones, animal maybe, but some didn't look like any animal I could name. Long finger-like shapes, a cracked piece of jaw, teeth. I didn't touch them, I just stared, the hair on the back of my neck rising. Something was wrong about that place, deeply wrong. Not supernatural, not haunted, but human. Later, I looked up old land records at the local township. That area hadn't been officially owned or developed in over 40 years. No recent structures had been registered. I even found some old survey maps. Nothing had ever been built there, according to the county. But when I asked around in town, one old man remembered something. He said that back in the 1980s, a man had gone missing in those woods. Supposedly, he'd built himself a cabin and gone off-grid. But after a few years, people stopped hearing from him. When someone finally went out to check, they said the place was abandoned. No body was found. The cabin was empty. A few months later, it was gone too. They assumed it was dismantled for wood or maybe collapsed and rotted into the ground. But no one ever went back out there again. He told me I should do the same. I wish I had listened, but I kept digging. I filed a request with the State Forestry Department for aerial photos of the area from the last few decades. When I got them, I flipped through each year, zooming in on the spot where the cabin had been. In the 1992 photo, the clearing was there and so was the cabin, clear as day. In the 1995 photo, the cabin was gone. But in the 1994 photo, something caught my eye. There was a second structure behind the cabin, something long and narrow, like a shed or maybe a trailer. It was gone in the next image. I couldn't explain that. I couldn't explain any of it. But one thing was clear. Someone had lived there, and someone had made sure it all disappeared. I don't talk about it much anymore. Not because I'm scared people won't believe me, but because I don't want them going out there to look for it. The forest took the cabin back. Or maybe the people who made it disappear came back for it. Either way, I've learned my lesson. If you're tired on the road, sleep in your car. Don't go wandering down strange paths. It was early November when I drove up into the northern part of Michigan to spend a week alone at a cabin I had rented off a small listing website. I wanted time away from work, away from the city, and most importantly, away from people. Things had been getting too noisy in my life. Constant emails, meetings, pressure. I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. I figured a quiet, isolated place with no phone reception and nothing around for miles would help clear my head. The listing described the place as an authentic hunting cabin, nothing fancy, but fully enclosed with a wood stove, propane for cooking, and a small solar setup for lights. I didn't need anything luxurious, just peace. That's what I thought I was going for. Took me about 7 hours to get there from home. The last 2 hours of that drive were down bumpy gravel roads that seemed to wind endlessly through thick forest. My tires kicked up leaves and small stones. There were no road signs for a long stretch, and I had to keep checking the printed directions I brought because GPS cut out a good hour earlier. Finally, after crossing an old-looking wooden bridge and passing a rusted-out truck half swallowed by weeds, I saw a clearing up ahead. The cabin sat in the middle of that clearing, low roof, unpainted wood, one window facing the front, and a small porch with a sagging chair. Behind it, tall pine trees rose like dark walls. To the left of the cabin, about 30 yards away, stood an old outhouse, gray and leaning a bit. A metal drum sat nearby, probably used for burning trash. I parked my truck off to the side and stepped out. The air was cold and clean. I stood there for a minute just breathing it in, trying to let the quiet settle into my bones. No traffic, no hum of electronics, just wind in the trees and the creak of wood as I walked up the porch and opened the door. The inside was exactly what I expected, bare floorboards, a small kitchen area with a propane burner, a wooden table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a narrow cot in the corner with a thick wool blanket. There were hooks on the walls for hanging gear and a wood stove that looked solid but ancient. A metal box beside it held logs and kindling. There was a small storage closet at the back, and next to it, a ladder that led up to a low loft with just enough room to sleep if I didn't mind bumping my head. I unpacked most of my things quickly. Sleeping bag, canned food, a camp stove for backup, water jugs, lanterns, and a rifle. I wasn't hunting, but I didn't come out here unarmed either. Black bears were still around this late in the season, and if something worse showed up, well, it didn't hurt to be prepared. The first day was uneventful. I split some firewood, walked around the area, and got a sense of the trails that led off into the woods. I noticed old tire tracks in the dirt not far from the cabin, half faded, like someone had been there weeks ago. I figured maybe it was a hunter or someone else who had stayed here recently. No big deal. I cooked a simple meal and settled in by the fire as darkness fell early, like it always does in the fall. I read a little by lantern light, then went up to the loft to sleep. The wind picked up during the night and whistled through the trees, and I heard a few thumps on the roof, probably branches or pine cones. Still, I couldn't shake a strange tension in my chest, even though there was no clear reason for it. On the second day, I explored deeper into the woods. I followed a path that twisted around a small pond, now half frozen and covered in brown leaves. I found deer tracks, a few claw marks on a tree trunk, maybe from a black bear, and something else that gave me pause. An old campsite probably abandoned for years. The remains of a fire ring were still there, and the rusted frame of what looked like a folding chair. The air felt heavier there. I didn't stay long. Back at the cabin, I noticed something strange. One of the water jugs I left on the porch had been knocked over. It was on its side, lid unscrewed, water soaked into the wood. At first, I thought maybe I had just not screwed it on tight, or maybe wind knocked it. But the porch was covered, and it hadn't been that windy. I chalked it up to my own clumsiness and didn't think much of it. Still, I moved the rest of the supplies inside. The third day started fine. I had coffee over the fire and hiked a different trail that climbed up a steep hill with a view of the woods below. It was quiet. No animals, no birds, not even the sound of branches breaking. Just the cold and the silence. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, but also how fragile that feeling was. Like if something broke it, it would break hard. When I came back in the afternoon, I noticed fresh prints in the mud near the side of the cabin. Not boot prints, bare feet, human. They were small and narrow, like a man's foot, not a child's, but they were bare. In November, out here, no vehicle tracks, no other signs of someone being nearby. Just those prints, circling part of the cabin and leading toward the woods, then vanishing into the underbrush. I stared at them for a long time. My first thought was that someone might be squatting nearby, maybe a hermit, maybe someone unstable. I walked the area slowly, my rifle slung over my shoulder, but I found nothing. No signs of a nearby camp, no movement in the trees. I went back inside and locked the door even though I didn't think it would do much. That night, I slept on the main floor with the rifle beside me. I didn't go up to the loft. The fire in the stove crackled quietly, but outside, I kept hearing faint sounds. Branches snapping, soft shuffling footsteps in the leaves. Never close, just distant enough to make me second-guess whether I heard anything at all. On the fourth day, I found something that made me feel real fear. I went to the outhouse in the morning and noticed something scratched into the inside of the door. It wasn't there before. 5 tally marks, dug deep into the wood. Fresh. The grooves were clean, splintered at the edges. I ran my finger over them. They'd been done with something sharp, knife maybe, and it meant one thing to me. Someone had been here after me, close enough to use the same outhouse. I didn't stay out there long. I rushed back into the cabin and checked everything. Nothing was missing. Nothing seemed moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I considered leaving early, but I told myself it might just be paranoia. Maybe the scratches were old, and I just hadn't noticed them. I wanted to believe that. I needed to. That night, it snowed a little, just enough to dust the clearing and the porch. I stayed up late with the lantern off, just listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow. They circled the cabin. I sat completely still, not even breathing, rifle pointed at the door. The footsteps paused at the porch. I heard a soft creak. The porch boards, then silence. I waited until morning to open the door. The prints were there, a full set circling the building and stopping at the steps. Bare feet again, long strides, no shoes. I followed them to the edge of the trees. They just stopped. No turnaround, no sign of retreat. They just ended. I spent most of the day inside after that. I kept the fire low, didn't cook anything, didn't even move much. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was inside. I tried to stay calm, but I kept thinking of those tallies. 5 marks, like a count. Was I number 5? Was it a countdown? On the 5th night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the corner with my back to the wall, rifle in hand. It was colder now, and the snow came down harder. I barely moved. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something, soft tapping on the glass window. Not a knock, not even hard enough to break. Just the gentlest tap, like fingernails. Then nothing. I didn't look. I didn't want to see. I just sat there, heart thudding, barely blinking. The fire burned out sometime before dawn, and I let it. I sat in the cold, waiting. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was done. I packed fast, stuffing everything into the truck without care. I didn't eat. I didn't check anything. I just got in, turned the key, and left the cabin behind. I drove back down that long gravel road faster than I should have, tires sliding on the snow-covered turns. I didn't stop once. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Not really. I mentioned to a friend that I cut my trip short because the weather turned bad. That was true enough. But every night since, I've thought about that tapping, about those footprints, about how they just stopped. A few weeks later, I looked up the listing again, curiosity or maybe something else. The site was gone. Not just the cabin listing, everything. The domain didn't even exist anymore. I've thought about it a lot, what I went through. I've tried to come up with a logical explanation. A local off-the-grid person who liked to mess with people. Someone squatting in the woods. A crazy guy who didn't want others nearby. Maybe even just some drifter who happened to find my cabin and wanted to scare me off. It's all possible. But what sticks with me more than anything else is how careful they were. No confrontation, no vandalism, just subtle things. A jug. I'd rented the cabin to get away from people. That was the whole idea. A place deep in the woods of northern Maine, far enough off the grid that I'd lose cell service 10 minutes before I even reached the driveway. No work calls, no internet, no distractions. Just me, a couple weeks off from my IT job, some trail maps, and a stocked cooler. The listing said it was a hunting cabin, though it hadn't been used for that in years. The photos showed it was basic, single-story, no frills, not even a real bathroom, but it had a roof, a wood stove, and a cot. That's all I wanted. I packed everything carefully. Water, food, a camp stove, extra fuel, warm clothes, trail boots, a sleeping bag good down to zero, backup batteries, even a flare gun I'd never used before. I wasn't new to the woods, but I also wasn't arrogant about it. I'd done solo hikes in the Appalachians, some light camping in the Rockies, and several weekend getaways in Vermont during the fall. But this time felt different before it even began. Not for any spooky reason, just more isolated. It was almost 5 hours of driving from where I lived in Massachusetts. The last 20 miles were on dirt roads that seemed to change direction without warning. No signage, no markers, no other cars. I used the printed directions the owner emailed me, which felt ancient but accurate. The final stretch curved sharply downhill, dipped between two steep hills, and then opened into a wide clearing where the cabin stood, surrounded on three sides by thick woods. A narrow trail led off to the west, disappearing into pines that swallowed the light. The air was dead still when I parked. No birds, no rustling, just quiet and trees. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, more weathered. Paint flaked from the edges. A dented metal chimney stuck out of the roof like a snapped antenna. I walked around first, checking everything like I always do. The door had a simple padlock, which I unlocked with the code the owner gave me. Inside, it was clean but bare. Wooden floor, a steel cot, a single table, one chair, a couple of shelves with dust-covered lanterns, and a metal stove in the corner. There was no insulation that I could see, just old wood planks for walls. I lit the stove first. It was cold already even though it was mid-September. Night temperatures in this area dropped fast. The woodpile outside was dry, thank God, and I got a good fire going within 30 minutes. I set up my sleeping bag on the cot, organized my gear, and then stepped outside with a beer to watch the sun go down behind the pines. There was a strange feeling in that clearing. Not threatening, not eerie, just still, as if everything was waiting. The quiet made my thoughts louder. Took me a few hours to settle in, and when night came, it came hard. I had a lantern inside, but I didn't use it much. I liked the dark when it was just me. The first night was uneventful. I woke up cold once around 3 a.m., fed the fire, then went back to sleep. No weird dreams, no scratching at the windows, no animals sniffing around the cabin, just silence and blackness. It wasn't until the third day that something began to feel off. I'd been hiking the trail behind the cabin most of that day. It wasn't marked on the official maps I brought, but the dirt path was clear enough. It snaked through the forest in long curves and gentle climbs, probably used by hunters years ago. I followed it for nearly 2 hours before deciding to turn back. I'd brought a small day pack with food, water, and a compass, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. But on the way back, I noticed something strange. About halfway to the cabin, I passed a section I didn't remember. A small dip in the trail with 2 boulders on either side and a broken tree laying across the ground. I was sure I hadn't seen it on the way up. I stopped and looked around. Nothing had changed. No sudden wind, no strange smells. But I had the uneasy feeling you get when you return to a place and something's out of place. Like coming home and finding a chair pulled out that you didn't touch. Back at the cabin, I convinced myself I must have missed it the first time. I made dinner on the small propane stove and read for a bit by the lantern light. That night, I woke again at 3 a.m., same as the night before. I don't know what woke me. There was no noise, no sudden dream, just an instinct that told me to sit up. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The fire had died almost completely. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. I threw a few logs in the stove and lit them carefully, keeping my movements slow and quiet. I remember glancing at the window next to the cot and having the intense, irrational feeling that someone was standing just out of sight. I didn't go to the window. I didn't move after lighting the fire. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and faced the wall. I told myself it was nothing, but it felt like something had been there, watching, waiting for me to move. The next morning, I walked the trail again. I had to prove to myself that the boulders had always been there, that the broken tree had fallen months ago, not hours. But when I got to the spot, the tree was gone. The boulders were still there, but the tree I clearly remembered laying across the trail was upright, rooted even. I stood staring at it for a long time. My mind tried to explain it. Maybe I mistook a different log for a fallen tree. Maybe the tree had never fallen. Maybe I was sleep deprived. But none of it felt right. The ground around the base of the tree was disturbed. Fresh dirt, too loose, not packed. It looked like something had recently been moved, either dug up or buried. I bent down and ran my fingers through it. The soil was cold. No tracks, no tools, no signs of animals. I didn't follow the trail beyond that point again. That night, I locked the cabin door for the first time. Not that it would stop anything. It was just a thin piece of plywood with an old bolt. I kept my flashlight on my chest and slept with my boots still half-laced. Around midnight, I heard movement, not far off. Something brushing through the dry leaves behind the cabin. Not fast, not animal-like. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. I sat up, clicked off the flashlight, and listened. It stopped after a few minutes. Then I heard it again, this time on the opposite side of the cabin. Something circled the cabin 3 times that night. No knocking, no sounds at the windows, just the steady movement of footsteps dragging through the brush, pausing, then moving again. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed my gear. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I also knew something was watching me. The woods around the cabin weren't right anymore. I couldn't explain it, but the silence felt deeper, heavier, like the forest was pressing in from all sides. I locked the door, even though I didn't plan on returning, and walked to my car. It wouldn't start. The battery was dead, completely. Not a single light on the dash. It was a new battery. I'd driven the car every day before the trip. It had never given me problems. I opened the hood and checked the connections. Nothing looked loose. No corrosion. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. I considered walking to the main road, but it was at least 15 miles back, and I didn't know which fork I'd taken to get here. I hadn't marked it. I'd relied on printed directions and hadn't thought to log GPS coordinates. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi. I was stuck. I decided to spend one more night, just to rest, to think. I still had food and water. The cabin wasn't safe, but it was shelter. I kept the fire low and slept lightly, waking at every sound. At some point, I heard movement on the roof. Slow, measured steps, pacing. Then silence. Then a thump above me, as if something heavy had been dropped. To first light, I stepped outside. The woods looked normal, but on the roof, there were marks. Scrapes in the dust, lines carved into the soft pine boards. I climbed up to get a better look, using a fallen branch as a makeshift ladder. There were boot prints. Human, a size or 2 larger than mine. Deep tread, not old, clear as day. I jumped down and didn't go back inside. I followed the trail west, hoping to find another road or a hunting shack. Anything. I walked for hours. Every bend looked the same. Pines, dead leaves, stones. Then, somehow, I was back at the same spot with the 2 boulders. The tree was still upright, but now the ground around it was more disturbed, almost like it had been dug again. A deep hollow in the shape of a shallow grave. There was something white sticking out of the dirt. I reached down and pulled. It was cloth, dirty canvas, like a jacket or a tarp. I tugged harder and uncovered part of a sleeve. Inside it was a bone, thin, cracked, weathered, not an animal's. I dropped it and ran. I ran until my legs cramped, until my lungs burned, until I fell face first into the leaves. When I looked up, I was staring at my own boot prints going in the wrong direction. I was running in circles. By nightfall, I gave up and returned to the cabin. I didn't light the fire. I didn't sleep. I sat against the door with the flare gun in my lap and listened. I wasn't looking for anything special when I booked the cabin. I just needed quiet. I had quit my job the month before. Not in a dramatic way, just one of those decisions that grows on you like rust. Every morning for years I'd woken up to the same digital clock, dressed in the same half-dark, taken the same exact route to the office where I spent most of my waking life in a chair, facing a monitor I could draw from memory. I hit a point where I realized I hadn't done anything real in years. I hadn't built anything, hadn't touched the ground, hadn't even been truly alone without distractions. I wanted silence. I wanted some version of peace I hadn't felt in forever. The cabin I rented was on the edge of a national forest in northern Montana. Closest town was about 30 minutes down a winding road. Not even a real town, just a single gas station, a diner, and a place that sold basic groceries. The guy who rented me the cabin owned about 100 acres of forest and open land. He had a website where he listed a few different spots, but I picked the one farthest from the rest. A simple wood cabin with no electricity, no running water, no cell signal. Just a propane stove, a wood-burning fireplace, and a hand pump for water. The pictures showed it nestled near the base of a steep ridge, surrounded by pine and spruce, a field behind it, and deep woods beyond. I arrived in late September. The drive-in was long but beautiful. Bright yellow aspens, fading green firs, and patches of red brush in the valleys. The dirt road got worse the closer I got. At one point, I had to stop and move a fallen branch myself. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly like I wanted it to. Small, weathered, quiet, and forgotten. Just a rectangle of rough wood planks, a tin roof, a porch with a single chair, and a stack of firewood beside the door. There was an outhouse about 20 yards behind it, and a trail leading into the woods, though it looked overgrown and hadn't been used in a while. Inside was one room, a cot, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with some dusty pots, a few oil lanterns, a small chest with extra blankets, and a heavy iron stove for cooking and heat. The windows had old curtains but no blinds. The floor creaked when I walked on it, but everything felt solid. No insulation, just the raw wall planks. It smelled like old wood and cold air. I spent the first day settling in, collected some wood, tested the stove, lit the lanterns. I ate canned soup that night and read from a paperback I'd brought until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. The quiet out there was real, the kind that makes your ears ring at first. No engines, no buzz from wires, not even a ticking clock. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional crack of wood shifting in the stove. The first few days were perfect. I hiked around during the day, followed some animal trails, tried to sketch the landscape a bit. I wasn't much of an artist, but it gave me something to do. Nights were long, but not uncomfortable. I got used to the dark, to the slow, quiet rhythm of the forest. I felt like I was shrinking back into something simpler, more grounded. Around the 4th night, I heard something outside just after I got into bed. It wasn't much, just a soft crunch of dried leaves, like a step. Then silence, then another. My first thought was deer. I'd seen a few during the day, and they wandered everywhere. But the steps didn't sound like a deer. They didn't sound quick or light, just slow, deliberate crunches. Not close, but not far either. I sat up, listening. Nothing for a while. Then one more crunch. I stood, careful not to step on the squeakiest part of the floor. The window by the bed looked out toward the woods. I peeled back the curtain. It was pitch black beyond the porch. I waited. My eyes adjusted a bit, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no shape, no glow from eyes. It stopped eventually. I told myself it was just an animal. Maybe a bear. They wandered too, but it kept me awake longer than I'd like to admit. Next morning, I walked around the area near the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks I could clearly make out, but the leaves made it hard to tell. Everything was covered in a layer of dry pine needles, sticks, and decaying leaves. Still, I felt a little less sure of things. That night, I kept the fire going a little longer. On the 6th day, I followed that old trail into the woods. I packed a day bag, just some snacks, water, a flashlight, knife, and jacket. The trail was faint but still traceable. About 30 minutes in, I came across what looked like an old shack. It wasn't on any of the maps the cabin owner sent me. Just a slanted square structure tucked between some thick trees. The walls were mossy and rotting. The roof was caved in on one side. I didn't go in, just stood and looked at it. Something about it felt wrong. Not scary exactly, just forgotten in the worst kind of way. It didn't feel like part of the rest of the forest. It felt like something left behind that no one wanted to deal with. I marked a tree near it with a strip of orange tape from my bag and headed back before dark. That night, I heard the steps again. This time, they were closer, not directly outside, but maybe 10 or 15 feet from the cabin. Still slow. One paused, then another. They circled around the back. I didn't move. I lay there in bed, heart pounding. I'd left the lantern burning low, so the shadows were soft, flickering across the ceiling. Then the steps stopped. I stayed frozen for almost an hour, waiting. No knock, no voice, no scratching, just silence. Eventually I got up and slipped my boots on. I held the knife in my right hand and cracked the door open with my left. I stepped out and stood on the porch. My breath made small clouds in the air. The moon was half full, casting enough light to see the edges of the field and the trees beyond. Nothing moved, no sound at all. I walked around the cabin once. Nothing. No tracks I could see, just the usual forest floor. I went back in and locked the door. The next morning I found something. Behind the cabin, maybe 5 feet from the wall, there was a pile of stacked rocks. Maybe 6 or 7 flat stones, each one smaller than the one below it, like a crude tower. I hadn't seen it before. I would have noticed something like that. It wasn't natural. Someone had built it. The rocks were clean, not covered in moss or dirt, like they'd been picked out and placed carefully. I knocked it over without thinking. I don't know why. I just didn't like seeing it there. I kicked the stones aside and walked back to the porch. That day, I didn't go far. Just cut some more wood and stayed close. I tried reading, but I couldn't focus. That night, the steps came back. Closer again. I didn't light the lantern this time. I sat in the dark, listening. They came from the front this time. I heard them stop on the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. Just once. Then silence. I held my breath. The door was locked, but the window next to it wasn't thick. I sat there with the knife, eyes straining in the dark, every sound sharper than usual. I thought I heard something brush against the wall. A hand, maybe, or fabric, but it was so soft I wasn't sure. Eventually the sound faded. I stayed up the rest of the night. Every now and then I thought I heard something out there. Breathing, maybe, but I couldn't trust my own ears anymore. At dawn, I opened the door slowly. On the porch, where the single chair had been, there was a dead squirrel. His body was laid flat on the seat. Its belly had been sliced open, and its insides removed, neatly, like someone had taken their time. There was no blood on the chair, just the body. The fur around its head was matted, like it had been pressed down or held. I stepped back inside and locked the door. I sat at the table for a long time. I knew someone was messing with me. It wasn't a game. It wasn't kids or a prank. I hadn't seen a single other person since I arrived. There weren't even tire tracks on the road. I was isolated in the truest sense, and someone else was out there watching, moving around at night, leaving things behind. I thought about leaving that day, packing up and driving back to town. But I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to let whoever it was scare me off. Maybe I wanted to catch them. Or maybe I just didn't want to admit I was scared. The next night was the worst. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, fire out, knife in hand, waiting. Around 2 a.m, I heard something again. Not steps this time. Breathing. Right outside the window behind me. Just slow, steady breaths. I didn't move. It stayed there for maybe a full minute. Then silence. I didn't hear it walk away. Just nothing. After an hour, I stood and looked out. The moon was bright enough now that I could see the tree line. And in that moment, I saw a shape standing there, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. Tall, still, facing the cabin. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. Next morning, I packed up. I didn't clean. I didn't fold the blankets. I just threw I had been renting cabins off and on for years, mostly in off-season months when the rates dropped and the woods were quieter. I wasn't looking for solitude because I was some poetic soul or anything like that. I just liked the silence. My job was remote, writing technical manuals for a logistics company, and as long as I had a stable internet connection and electricity, I could work from pretty much anywhere. So, every once in a while, I'd drive out into the middle of nowhere, stay for a couple weeks, work by day, hike in the afternoons, drink at night, and just breathe air that didn't smell like car exhaust and burnt coffee. The cabin I booked this time was somewhere up in the Adirondacks, northern New York. It sat right off a trailhead, about 40 minutes from the nearest town, and was owned by an older guy who didn't even live in the state anymore. He had it listed on a site that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2006. There were 5 grainy photos, no reviews, and a short description that just said, remote, off-grid, generator power, well water, no neighbors for miles. That was exactly what I wanted. I wasn't looking for luxury or Instagram aesthetics, just peace. I drove in late on a Thursday afternoon, the sky cloud-covered and dim, not quite raining but always threatening to. My phone had lost signal about 20 minutes before I reached the dirt turnoff that led to the property. The road was deeply rutted and slick from earlier rain. Trees arched overhead like they were growing toward each other, darkening the already dull sky. I had to ease my little crossover SUV over roots and rocks, crawling at 5 miles an hour. Finally, after what felt like way too long, I spotted the cabin. It wasn't much. Single story, 1 window in the front, wood-paneled with a slightly tilted metal roof. There was a fire pit surrounded by old stumps that served as seats, a metal rack for chopping wood, and what looked like an outhouse further back in the trees. The porch sagged in the middle, and the railing looked like it had been kicked or hit with something heavy, cracked in the center and held together with bungee cords. Still, it was standing, and the lockbox code the owner gave me worked. Inside was small but clean. Just 1 room, bed, table, kitchenette, tiny bathroom, and 1 door leading to a back room that looked like it had once been a pantry, but now held a water tank, generator switch, and shelves of dusty cans. There was no Wi-Fi, but I didn't care. I had my satellite hotspot, which I set up immediately. It worked fine. I ran a speed test, downloaded some emails, then shut my laptop and unpacked. I planned on staying for 12 days. The first 3 days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, waking up early, making instant coffee on the propane stove, working until the early afternoon, then taking long hikes along the narrow trails that spiderwebbed out from the cabin. I'd walk for hours, barely seeing a soul. There were signs of human life, old trail markers, faded flagging tape, boot prints hardened in mud, but I never ran into anyone. On the 4th night, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning because something was tapping the side of the cabin. It was a light, irregular sound, not like wind, more like something small and hard flicking against the wall. I lay still in the dark for a long time, listening, trying to figure out what it was. Trees, maybe? A loose branch? Then the sound stopped. I stayed awake for another hour, but nothing else happened. I told myself it was just the wind. That's what it usually was. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the cabin just to check. I didn't see anything strange. A few pine cones were scattered around the foundation, but no big branches or anything leaning against the wood. I went for a hike, came back, worked some more, and forgot about it. The next night, same time, around 2:30 again, I woke up to the same tapping. This time I sat up immediately. I couldn't explain why, but it sounded closer, like it was hitting the wall right behind the bed. I didn't have any weapons with me, but I grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the window. I didn't turn the light on, just stood there in the dark, breathing slowly, heart pounding. I waited. The tapping stopped again, just like before. In the morning, I found nothing new. No prints, no marks on the wall. It was starting to feel like my brain was playing tricks on me. I chalked it up to animals, maybe squirrels or birds or something in the eaves. The weather had warmed slightly, and maybe that was enough to bring out more wildlife. But I couldn't shake the unease that had crept into my gut. That afternoon, I didn't hike. I stayed close, cleaned up the inside of the cabin, read an old paperback I found in the cabinet. Around sunset, I decided to chop some wood for the fire pit. I grabbed the axe and started splitting the few logs stacked near the rack. After about 20 minutes, I noticed something odd. Across the clearing, on the far edge where the trees thickened again, a small piece of orange fabric fluttered from a branch about 5 feet up. It wasn't flagging tape. It looked more like a strip of clothing, like it had been torn off and stuck there. I left the axe and walked over to it. Sure enough, it was a piece of nylon, maybe from a jacket or backpack. It was dirty and faded, but I could still tell it had once been bright orange. I looked around. There was no obvious path nearby, just dense underbrush. Still, someone had to have come through here, and not too long ago. The fabric wasn't sun-bleached or torn to shreds. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, checking the clock, listening for sounds. At one point, I thought I heard something brush the porch. A creak, maybe, but it didn't repeat. When I finally did drift off, I dreamed of being watched from the trees, of narrow eyes behind bark and bushes. The next morning, I felt hungover even though I hadn't had anything to drink. My nerves were frayed. I couldn't sit still. I took another hike just to burn energy, heading west this time, trying to follow the slope of the land. I ended up stumbling onto an old trail that didn't show up on any maps. A narrow, overgrown line that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Still, the way the grass was bent and some of the brambles were broken told me someone had walked through it recently. Within the past few days, at least. I followed it for about 20 minutes until it just stopped near a dry creek bed. Nothing around. No campsites, no signs of people. When I turned back, I kept hearing small noises behind me. Twigs snapping, faint rustling. Every time I stopped to listen, the forest went still. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door for the first time since I arrived. That night, something knocked on the wall. It wasn't tapping anymore. It was a knock. 3 slow, spaced out thuds. Then silence. I didn't move. I just lay there in the dark, breathing through my nose, trying to stay as still as possible. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. My ears were straining, listening for any follow-up sound. Footsteps, another knock, anything. Nothing came. In the morning, I found boot prints behind the cabin. They were clear in the damp earth, about a size 10 or 11, maybe. The heel tread was worn down, probably old hiking boots. They led from the woods, stopped at the wall behind the bed, then turned around and disappeared back into the trees. There were no prints near the front door. Whoever it was hadn't approached from the road or the trail. They had come from the deep woods, visited that one wall, and left. I stood staring at them for a long time, holding the axe in one hand, not really sure what to do. My instinct told me to leave, just pack up and go. But part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was a hiker who got lost or confused. Maybe someone who saw the cabin and approached without thinking. But that didn't make sense. Who knocks on a random wall at 2:30 in the morning and then walks away? I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up in the only chair, with the axe beside me, lights off, listening. I stayed that way until dawn. No knocks, no sounds, just silence. The next night, it happened again. Same knock, same spot, same rhythm. This time, I ran outside with the flashlight and the axe, heart pounding so loud I could barely hear myself think. I shined the light everywhere, into the trees, across the clearing, into the brush behind the cabin. Nothing, no movement, no person, but there were fresh prints again, right where the old ones had been. I made a decision. I was leaving the next day. When morning came, I loaded the car as quickly as I could. It was still early, around 7 a.m., fog still low across the treetops. I checked everything twice. Before getting in the driver's seat, I looked back one last time, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a camera lens peeking out from one of the trees about 40 feet away. It was wedged into a low fork of a pine tree, partly hidden by moss and leaves, but clearly there. A trail cam. I walked to it and found it strapped tightly to the trunk, pointing directly at the cabin. It was weathered and camouflaged, not easy to spot unless you were looking. I yanked it down. The memory card was still inside. I threw it into the car and drove away fast, bouncing over the ruts, not caring if I cracked a